We're in the age of customer experience being the critical way that consumers judge interactions with businesses and really placing a priority on making that experience as powerful as it can be.
Hey there, James here, and you're listening to the Own the Moment podcast, the show where we explore the complex and always evolving landscape of marketing, advertising, and branding, and try to get to the bottom of what it means to be a truly memorable brand. The Own the Moment podcast is brought to you by Como Technologies, a self-service, complete customer engagement platform that helps you cut through the noise to truly connect with your customers and retain and grow those connections over time. With Como, you can build and deploy new campaigns, activations, promotions, and programs in days, not months, and our software is used by some of the world's biggest consumer brands, from Heineken to Budget, Goodman Fielder, Foxtel, JLL, Williams Racing, and McDonald's. Learn more at como.tech. Today's guest is Simon McCrudden, a partner at Accello, an agency that builds for what they call the experience era, boasting a client list including McDonald's, TikTok, and Netflix. Named by the Australian Financial Review as one of the 100 fastest growing companies in the country, Simon and their team have their finger on the pulse of pop culture and how brands can leverage it to earn attention. Simon and his team's entire thesis is that building compelling experiences at every touchpoint along a customer journey is now table stakes for earning and winning customer attention and love. Now, if that sounded like a bunch of corporate marketing babble, keep listening, because during this episode, we'll discuss how Virgin turned the absolute worst part of flying into a memorable experience and what Fred Again's boiler room set means for brands. We had a fascinating discussion about the attention economy, why it's getting harder for brands to cut through the noise, and why Simon believes brands should spend more time trying to find their unique voice, not finding great advertising. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Let's get to the show. Simon McCrudden, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me, James.
Great. So, Simon, I found this quote from you, which I just want to read to you. It reads, "Brands have so many opportunities to build deep connections with consumers, but it has never been harder to create a memorable, lasting impact with them." Could you unpack that for me? Why is it getting harder?
Yeah, okay. This is the problem with putting pen to paper and leaving quotes in the world to be found, isn't it? It's quite good you found that one, though. I guess there's an obvious point about the attention economy and the sheer volume of content that people can look at and the myriad of ways that content can be screened out. So I think at a very base level, that's why it's harder. But I think underneath that, there's a few other reasons. I think in order to create those memorable and lasting impacts requires originality and creativity, and those things require time. And time is critical to develop the ideas and activations that are going to cut through. But sadly, we live in a very fast-paced world, which often prioritizes task completion over impact. So I think that affects the ability to have that memorable, lasting impact. And I think secondly, we've possibly become a bit too lost in the world, in the minutiae of kind of niche channels, targeted messaging. And I think we've lost sight of how bigger impact work can bring people of all backgrounds together. I think when you think of films or, like the Marvel franchises or, musicians like Taylor Swift, for example, these are kind of entertainment properties that may be preferred by a particular niche or generation, but actually have broad universal appeal. And I think good comms do that too. But we have possibly lost sight because of the weeds of segmentation and niche audiences. And I think finally, the reason why it's harder to create those memorable impacts is that we're often trying to, or oftentimes brands try to reflect audiences too much, rather than trying to find their own unique voice. And I think the danger of that is if all you're doing is reflecting the audience that you're seeking to engage, everyone else is doing that as well. So it's harder then to be distinct and become memorable and have an impact with audiences.
That's really interesting. I want to sort of dig into that last point a little bit, reflecting audiences. Could you go a little bit deeper? So, what does it mean to, I guess, to not do that? So what does it mean to try and, is it, let me rephrase that. What does it mean to not try to reflect the audience, but rather find your authentic voice?
Find your own voice. Yeah. I think, we often talk about brands as people, That's that kind of that cliche idea that brands are people and we have to give them personalities and values and tone of voice. But I think if you follow that logic through, the best people that we know, and you're the friends that you love and the friends that I love, they don't tend to be people that will change who they are dependent on who they're talking to, right? They have a very strong sense of self, strong sense of authenticity. They know what they believe, they know what they stand in, and they're not chasing after appealing to whoever they're talking to at that moment. And I think the same applies to really, really good brands. So, and I know it's a very overused brand, but you look at Nike, for example, and Nike has talked about how they didn't discover good advertising, they found the power of their own voice. And that voice is hugely appealing to lots of people. And sure, they might executionally do things that are going to appeal to certain audiences. But, a Nike can talk to an 80-year-old golfer, white upper class golfer, and it can talk to a 14-year-old kid living in a council estate, and they're still true to who they are. I think there is a slight danger sometimes if it's just about, say, a brand wants to reinvent itself and bring new people into it, and they go, right, we need to talk to people who are in their 20s. And the temptation is to suddenly rush to, let's kind of show that we get what's cool about being in your 20s, or let's use a soundtrack for the ad that is something that this audience likes. And I don't think that's a very short-term answer, and I think it's the wrong answer, because I think they need to have a sense of who are they, what do they care about, and then almost kind of trust that there are going to be a group of people that share those values as well. And I think that's what that gives you then, is a brand that is much more substantial and much more likely to last into the long term.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think that Nike point is like, it's so obvious once you've said it, but it's one of those things that the power in that their message really stays the same no matter who they're talking to. So what do you make of, just on that point of finding new audiences and maybe sort of, trying to sort of keep up with societal trends? So what do you make of the Bud Light controversy over the last month or so? What's your take? Obviously now that we're a month or so removed from from it happening, what's your take on that now, with that in mind?
That is a good question, and not one I was expecting you to ask me. It's hard, this stuff. I think that big brands have a responsibility to be inclusive and demonstrate that they are inclusive. And I think also hold, unless they've done something particularly offensive or wrong, I think they need to kind of stand behind what the decisions that they've made. I think there's a very purist approach to that question around, well, who is your target audience? And actually, are the marketing team out of touch with their target audience? I don't know enough about Bud Light's position in the market and all of those things to be able to answer that. I applaud their intent to demonstrate modernity, show that actually, the world of drinking beer is no longer the kind of the cliche world that some people might think it is. But I think, let's be honest, the whole thing was just handled terribly, right? Whether they were right to do that or not, the fallout from it and how it was handled and all of the vitriol that followed was really not good. And I think there's a responsibility to, having made that decision, to kind of really stand behind it and show support and show commitment to it. And I think they didn't react necessarily that well to that.
Yeah, no, it's a sort of touchy subject and hot topic indeed.
Yeah, I am very conscious of giving an overly kind of political tap dance answer, but I think it's almost too easy in some of these cases to say, oh, it's either good or it was bad, and I think it's grey, it's not black and white, I think.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So going back to that original quote, you say brands have so many opportunities to build deep connections with consumers. What do you mean by that? What are these opportunities, and are brands missing them?
Yeah, I think they often are. There's opportunities just from the sheer volume of possible touch points a brand can have, and I think when you look at the entire experience that your brand offers, I think there are so many really great ways, so multiple ways that you can inject memorable and powerful brand moments within that. Like I really love, we didn't do this, but I really love the Virgin Australia middle seat lottery idea, because who would have thought that having a middle seat on a plane could be a chance to create a positive impact and a memorable moment? And what I like about that is when there's a depth of thinking around what is the entire experience we offer, what are some of those pain points, and then how can we have a really interesting brand moment in that? Not just solve it from a customer pain point of view, but actually turn it into something that says something about who we are as a brand.
Yeah, could you just, for those that aren't aware, could you just sort of unpack, what is the Virgin middle seat lottery, and how does it work?
Yeah, so they've got a new brand platform around Wonderful. I mean, we could debate for days whether that's actually true and believable or not. I fly on Virgin Australia a lot, so I'm not entirely sure it is. But I guess one of the manifestations of that platform was for them to look at, well, what are those experiences within Virgin that maybe are not as wonderful as we'd like them to be, and how can we make them more wonderful? And I think that intent is fantastic. And the middle seat lottery was basically, if you end up flying in a middle seat and no one wants the middle seat, you're either an aisle or a window person. If you end up having to fly in the middle seat, then your details get entered into a lottery to win a prize. And so it's trying to bring that moment of wonderful and joy to what is otherwise a pretty crap experience. And so what I really like about that is they've actually gone down to the level of detail of going, right, once people are on the plane, what is not enjoyable about, what is not wonderful about this? And then they've turned that moment into something that's a real a brand promise moment. So I think it's great.
And I mean, the name of this podcast is, of course, Own the Moment. And that's really sort of the core thesis of that whole platform is really that, right, there are these moments which brands let slip by. And so I think it's a fantastic example of that.
Yeah, and I think it's I think that the idea of owning the moment is such a good one. I think there is a slight it's a balance, right? Because what you don't want is for every single moment to have some brand message rammed down your throat.
Right.
Because there are times when I'm using if I'm using a bank app, I just want to know how much money I've got in my account for the next week. I don't need some brand message kind of getting in the way of that. So I think there are times when functionally you might go, just stay well clear rather than ramming it down my throat. But there's other times when there's actually all of these opportunities to do something at a brand level that are missed. And that's what I think is interesting. You can take a holistic view of the entire brand experience, then that opens up those opportunities.
Yeah. And I think that for me, the Virgin Lottery, it's like there's it's sort of born of a very clear and concise insight. And then I think it's sort of, there's that, it feels creative and sort of memorable, like for all the it's sort of quite a basic idea, but I think there's something about the sort of cleverness of the creativity there. And so going back to another of your quotes that you've left behind you online, you say that you believe creativity has the power to transform business and lives. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a belief that's it's a much bigger belief than the world of advertising or marketing. I think it's about how creativity and lateral thinking can underpin transformation and looking at the world differently in all sorts of ways. And I think for me, at least, that's why, at least for now, AI isn't going to replace humans or take away everything that humans can do, because at the moment, really, only humans, as far as I know, have the ability to offer those weird, odd, different ways of looking at situations. You look at some of the imagery that comes out of Midjourney, and it's amazing. Like, it just looks fantastic. But when you think about great moments in art where new art movements have been formed, it's not. It's kind of almost a rejection of what's gone before, and a very individualized, different way of looking at the world that has formed that. And so, I think that creativity, in that sense, has the power to transform business lives, because it offers a very different way of looking at the world that can force dramatic change in a good way. I think there is something, though. I think again, I don't know if this is controversial or not. I don't really know, but I think there's that kind of modern trend of saying everyone's creative. Well, I think it's true to a degree in that everyone can play the guitar,
Right.
but we can't all be Jimi Hendrix. So I think everyone can be creative and have creative thoughts and ideas, but I think it is a very specialist skill to really hone in on that lateral thought that can make the leaps. And not all of us can do that. I mean, I'm not particularly good at doing that, and lots of other people aren't. And so I think we need to kind of celebrate and acknowledge that there is an individual element to creativity and disruption and transformation. And if you want to do something different that can transform lives, you need to embrace the fact that it is often, it requires risk and uncertainty because it is about newness and things that haven't been done before.
Yeah, and I think that's where, I guess, a couple of months on from ChatGPT and Mid-Journey launching and all of that, I think that's where I fall on this as well, which is that, I think if anything, this just makes, the Hendrixes of marketing and creativity and advertising just more valuable because, it's very impressive. And, it's not to say that, even just internally here, ChatGPT is, can be great for, fixing grammar and, tightening up a paragraph. But I think, and look, maybe this looks very silly in 5 years, I don't know, but to think that it's going to come up with the next, Think Different or Mac OS PC or what? Look, I don't see it, but
I also think, I asked ChatGPT, it was for a pitch that we were working on to write a children's book around where the evil villain was poor sleep and the hero was this brand that we were working on, and those are the only parameters I gave. And the children's book was great. It followed all of the normal constructs of a children's book and storytelling. You can imagine reading it to a child and they'd be interested. But the hero and the villain were both male, and I hadn't said that they were a particular gender in my instructions, but that's what it fed back. And so I think AI builds on the biases that humanity have given it already, or what's the most generic kind of response, and it builds those in. Whereas I think true creative thinking is able to kind of step outside of that and just look at the world in a very, very different way.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's all of the great shifts, or I guess step changes in, whether it's marketing, advertising, or just pop culture, I guess is sort of right. They often are, these right turns, which look, maybe AI gets there, maybe it doesn't. I want to move on, Simon, to you and your work. And you're a partner at an agency called Accello. And the tagline, I guess, is, building brands for the experience era. What does that mean? How do you define the experience era? How is it different from before? So what was the era before that, and why are we in a new era? And can you, I guess, elaborate a bit on the thesis?
Yeah, sure. So, the experience era, I guess, refers to we're in the age of customer experience being the kind of critical way that consumers judge interactions with businesses, and really placing a priority on making that experience as powerful as it can be. I think historically, it was maybe. I don't know. I'm not a history of marketing person, but certainly a few years ago, it's probably more about thinking less holistically about the entire kind of experience and environment that you have. There was kind of the big fancy advertising that a company would do, and then there was the shop that people would go to buy the things that they saw advertised, So I guess that's one part is thinking holistically. I guess inherent in that as well is putting consumers at the heart of your thinking within businesses, within organizations, which is obviously a very good thing to do. And so that's kind of how we think about the experience era. And the way we think about it when we talk about building brands for the experience era, the other part of it is that people don't think in category silos. So, for example, I'm a upsider, so I'm with Upbank, and I love the experiences I have with them. So it's very playful, it's simple, I feel that on some level they have my interests at heart. They're clearly independent and different to the other banks, and I put a lot of value in independence just generally. So all of that wraps up a really compelling experience for me. But I then take that experience to other areas of my life, and I wonder, well, why isn't my food delivery brand like that? Or why isn't where I find my media or my news like that? And so the experience here is one where you are judged as a business versus the last great experience that someone had, not just versus your competition. So I guess that's the kind of world in which we need to build a brand. I think that, and we've touched on this already, but I think just to reiterate, we talk about brand experience. So we're not customer experience. I mean, we do customer experiences, but that underpinning of a brand experience is really critical. So we need to deliver great customer experiences. They need to be simple and intuitive and seamless and all those things. But brand experience approach is really to start with the brand and determine what experience do we want people to have with us in any environment. What is unique about the experience that we're going to offer them that ties back to the very core of our business. And then having worked that out, you then go, right, so what does that mean for customer experience? And then ultimately, what does that mean for UX, for example? Good customer experience has certain principles underpinning it, but it can often lead to everything being the same across all brands. But we know from multiple research studies that distinctiveness is the key to business growth. So therefore, we focus on brand experience and starting with the brand.
Yeah, that's so let's dig into some of the work you've done for brands, looking through the website, you've done work for McDonald's with the Macca's Monopoly, Netflix, some sort of Squid Game activation, the Starts on TikTok campaign. What do all of these have in common? What is it that you guys do? What's the red thread?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because on their own, they're all quite different, I guess. I mean, Monopoly is a kind of game through McDonald's. The Squid Game thing, as you said, was a big activation. TikTok was more of a kind of traditional ad campaign. I guess there's a couple of things that unite them. I mean, they're all in their own ways connected into and born from popular culture. Squid Game is probably quite a good example there, where that was, one of our kind of social team identifying just how quickly Halloween Squid Game costumes were selling. And then as a team, we jumped on that and we're like, right, how do we bring that really crazy doll from Squid Game to life in a really massive way in Sydney in a very short space of time? And the kind of cut through on that was epic. So that was kind of leaning into what was going on in pop culture at the time and making sure that we were there at Halloween in order to do that. And the TikTok work Starts on TikTok is really about, that brand just defines culture for so many people. So I think all of them are kind of born from what people love and from pop culture, I think is important. And I think it's also about, understanding what experience is appropriate for those brands at different points as well, I think. So, that Squid Game experience was absolutely about getting it in a very kind of public way. But we also then left all of the little cards, if you remember from the show, they all got left around Sydney, kind of in the day running up to the launch of the thing. We brought in kind of key influencers early to kind of get their content out. There was a very kind of smart PR influencer strategy that sat behind that. It wasn't just building a big thing and hoping people would come. TikTok Starts on TikTok. That's a big brand platform that kind of cements them as the place where interesting culture starts. But it was all about the kind of the people on the platform and celebrating all of the kind of idiosyncrasies and the unique things that they brought to it as well. So I think really kind of delving into what makes those brands special, what are people going to love when they interact with those experiences is probably the thing that unites them.
That's interesting. So what sorts of mistakes or missteps do you see brands making when trying to build for, I guess, this new experience era?
Yeah, I think some brands might fall short where they might create great customer experiences that are in their brand colors or tone of voice, but they might, a bit to that earlier conversation about middle seat lottery, they might miss out on the opportunity to create something truly distinctive from an experience point of view. It's almost, in any example, when you're thinking about a customer experience, it's always kind of good to ask the question, well, how would Nike do this differently if it was their customer experience? Or, how would, any brand that you think is interesting, how would they do it differently? Because if you see that they could do it differently, then I think you have to go back and say, well, what does our brand stand for that we're not conveying, or we're not bringing across in as interesting a way as we could at the moment? So I think maybe downplaying the value of brand in the experience era is a real miss for a lot of brands. Just assuming that customers say they want an easy, seamless experience. So if we do that, that's fine. I think that's a real kind of missed opportunity, and that's a mistake, because you're missing out on the chance to have something very kind of distinctive and meaningful that your brand stands for in that experience space. This is probably the bit where I plug, if you're one of those brands, give me a call and we can help you with that. So I think that's the mistake. Maybe undervaluing the role that brands can play in driving growth and driving share.
There's something in the sort of the old long and short of it. So, hey, we've obviously just been through COVID. We're in an era where, spending more and more time on our phones and online in general. Thinking about that Squid Game activation in the physical world, how do you think about sort of, online versus offline? And I'm curious as to, whether you have any insights there as to, where we're at now, and I guess, maybe moving forward, how should brands think about being present online versus offline? There's obviously the sort of the metaverse thing that, I guess has sort of petered out now, but was all the rage over the last couple of years. I mean, how do you think about online versus offline and brand?
Great question. I think, again, you have to take the holistic view, know where people are going to be wanting different bits of information interaction. I think you can't have a siloed view either way. I think it's important to understand, though, that people are spending a lot of time digitally, watching entertainment, needing information or looking for information. But that doesn't mean that the physical environment isn't important. I mean, at Excello, we've been really clear from the start that spatial and physical interactions and experiences are critical, and as critical and can be as critical as digital. And actually, they're not even separate, right? They merge and they blend in interesting ways, because you do an interesting spatial experience, and that has a life beyond that experience online in people's social channels, for example. So I think whilst we are more digital, we still live in the physical world. We still interact with human beings. We still get excited by the real stuff. And so I think it's really important for a brand and an agency to be able to take that very holistic view and understand that it's not one or the other. I think sometimes, we know that a number of traditional businesses can lag and they cannot gain the full picture of how people are interacting with them. Existing processes that they have internally, existing mindset from people that have been there a long time might lag them kind of catching up with where consumers are digitally. I think conversely, I think often digital startup brands can be sometimes too siloed in their thinking and see the world purely through a tech startup lens versus understanding that we do still inherently love things in the physical world.
I don't know if you...
Sorry, you go. I was going to say it's a long answer and I've got more to say, but you can probably ask something.
Well, I was just going to say, I don't know if this crossed your radar last year, but, I guess one of the hottest and, most exciting sort of, DJs right now is this, British guy, Fred Again. And he, played the classic Boiler Room set last year, and it had 20, 30 million views on YouTube. And it was just sort of, the one of the biggest sort of pop culture moments of last year. And I remember watching it and thinking, perhaps one of the reasons people connected so much with that, I mean, apart from the fact that the music's brilliant, was, I think there's something about people saw and were reminded by just how much in person, after years of, artists, playing concerts on Instagram Live and, that whole thing, maybe that Fred again set reminded people that actually being in a sweaty room with thousands of other people is actually something that we really crave and love and enjoy. So, I think, that for me was a really clear takeaway that yes, that isn't going away and probably will never go away. Hopefully not anyway.
No, I mean, I hope not too. I mean, I think the excitement, I mean, I'm too old to know much about Fred again, but I do remember the joy of being in a sweaty club with 1,000 people. And, it's live experiences we love that stuff, right? I mean, it's whether it's the concert or the football game or whatever it is, you can't beat that. I mean, there's something about just the raw emotion and the raw connection you have in the real world, which I think as humans, we crave that and we love that. And I think it's interesting, actually, when you look at a lot of the very best digital brands, so like a Google, for example, and you look at their advertising, and it is often some of the most heartfelt and emotional and human work out there. It's the story of, a grandmother and her granddaughter going to watch a football game again after, we're telling the story of how the grandmother's involvement in football. I mean, what a beautifully simple human story. And it's interesting that the tech brands, I think, recognize that humanity and realness and emotion are what drives us much more than algorithms and tech and upgrades.
Right. That's really interesting. Something on my mind is there's this American social scientist called Jonathan Haidt who's written a bunch of really interesting books, and he says about this digital about the digital world that it's like the connections are sort of, they give you all the you get the sense that you're sort of having relationships and building connections, but without any of the nourishment. And I think that's sort of a very interesting takeaway, regarding what we've been speaking about, building real connection. There's something about that sort of.
Yeah. And it's that great film Her from a few years ago, right? Which it might be a scary prophecy of the world to come. But yeah, I think the realness is always going to be critical. Now for brands, there's a bunch of times when I don't want to have to go to a real bank branch, and I don't want to have to go to something. Right. I don't want to have to go to a real supermarket. I just want it done for me really easily. So I think it's about understanding what is the right time to have the digital interaction, what's the right time to have the physical.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Simon, I want to move on to the quick fire round. And I want to start with a question, which is, what is your favorite marketing campaign of all time? Okay.
So my favorite marketing campaign of all time would be the work that Wyden and Kennedy Portland did for KFC over a number of years. I don't know the exact years, but it was, just the most fantastic collection of work from a brand experience point of view as well. I mean, the advertising was absolutely amazing, nailed everything from kind of all the product stuff that you'd want, all of the kind of the rational proof points, but just done in the most brilliantly emotional, funny way, totally modernized the brand. But then they also went off and just did crazy collaborations and, they did like kind of road trip cassettes for your car and, they released a fashion range. They did comic books featuring Colonel Sanders. And so just as a collection of work, it was just brilliant. I encourage everyone to go and look at it. It's amazing.
Yeah, I'll put I'll dig that out and put the link in the notes. So, obviously, we've talked a little bit about this idea of owning the moment. That's obviously the name of this show, something we're really excited about here. What's the best example of a brand that you've seen sort of own the moment? Obviously, the Virgin middle seat lottery, I think, is a fantastic example of that. Can you think of any others?
Oh God, I hate being put on the spot like this.
We can always edit. It's all good.
Yeah. I mean, there's the Super Bowl is always obviously good fodder for this sort of stuff with likes of what Oreos did a few years ago with the lights out. Yeah, I'd have to have a think about that. I mean, I think those kind of real time active, reactions to what's going on in the real world are often quite good. But I'll have to pass on answering that one right now, I'm afraid.
Right. I think that's actually a really good point. It's that sort of quick reaction to the moment is, that feels like a really solid one. What's the most overrated trend in marketing right now?
Oh man, I mean, this industry it's defined by overrated trends, I feel sometimes. That's a very hard question to answer. I mean, I'm tempted to say ChatGPT and Midjourney, but I also recognise that they are hugely powerful things that are going to completely transform, how we live. So it probably isn't overrated. I think the challenge in our industry is we sometimes latch onto these things and it takes our eye off the ball of what is important, which are some of the more fundamentals and some of the things that have been proven to work. We have a real desire to kind of grab the new and go with it. But I know that my family down, in Geelong, who are more like everyone in Australia than I am, they're not going to be particularly bothered about ChatGPT or Midjourney. They just want to know that a brand is going to do what it says and give them something at a good price. So I think the less we focus on those trends, the more we focus on the fundamentals is important.
Yeah, and I think that I sense what you're going to answer the next question with, which is, what is the opposite? What's the tactic that, we're not talking about that we, should be talking about? I guess underrated is maybe a way to frame that question.
Yeah, okay. I don't know. I think that, it follows on from the last answer. I think not changing is a good tactic for marketing, branding and advertising. I think, I don't mean never change. I don't mean become stuck doing things that aren't working, but I think resist the urge to change for change's sake, resist the urge to just blindly chase the new or do something completely different because there's been 3 articles about it. I think brands, again, back to this thing about people, the best people are those who are, if not consistent, at least coherent. You know who they are over time, you know who they are in different environments. So I think resist the urge to just change for change's sake would be the best tactic.
I think that's a great answer. And I think, going back to Nike and that whole, finding your voice and sticking to it, I mean, that for me, feels like a brand that, I guess it just hasn't. I mean, I know that, tactics, channels, tools, of course, that stuff, but really sort of in my lifetime, I can't think of any real huge change in their platform. Just Do It has been there forever. And, they find new ways to reinvent that, obviously. And Apple, I think, is probably...
So, sorry, James, you continue, sorry.
Well, just, Apple is probably another good example of a brand that really sort of, again, the sort of, I'm reminded of that sort of Mark Ritson quote, which is, the sort of marketing never really changes. It's the tools and the tactics change, but the fundamentals have been the same for 100 years and probably will be the same in 100 years. So I think that's a great answer. Last question, Simon. Who is the most interesting marketer and or brand in the world right now?
Yeah. I probably don't know. I don't know individual marketers too much. I think when you look around the world I'm always drawn to, it's very easy, I think, to look at a small brand and think that they are the most interesting, but it's kind of easy to be interesting when you're smaller, I think. I think it's those big brands who are doing interesting things. So brands like the Visa in New York, who've done an awful lot of really impactful and compelling work through McCann New York over there. I think they're kind of consistently kind of interesting. I think Macca's globally in different markets around the world, clearly, and in Australia, and all the work we do with Macca's as well, they're very they are such a marketing team globally at the top of their game, and you can see that in the output that comes out. Brands like Aldi, I think, possibly a bit smaller, but have kind of shown again in multiple markets, even with different agencies, how they have a very true sense of who they are and what they should do. I think there is some interesting movement in marketing, particularly from, say, Airbnb, who, very famously and publicly have dialed back on the performance marketing and moved more into the reinvestment in brand. I'm very encouraged by that because I've got a very strong belief in the power of brand, and I think it's been downplayed over the last few years. And I think seeing a brand like that, which is a very modern, tech-based digital brand, recognizing the value that investing in brand over performance can have, I think that makes them very interesting because it is counter-trend and counter-cultural.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. A couple of things there. I totally agree on, McDonald's. I think one of the things, speaking about that difference between small and big brands, I loved that campaign they ran a few years ago, which was, big enough to make a difference. And I think that was obviously in the context of plant-based and reducing emissions. And I think that was just, that's such a beautiful tagline. Aldi, completely agree. A plug for the podcast. I had Jamie Peat on from McCann, Manchester, who's worked with Aldi.
How lovely is Jamie? He's great, isn't he?
Yeah, he's brilliant. And that was a great episode. So definitely go and listen to that if you want to dig into the Aldi story. Simon, thank you so much for being on the show. This was a real pleasure.
Great. Thanks for having me, James, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Own the Moment podcast. If you liked this episode, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss upcoming episodes. And to suggest a guest or provide feedback, please visit our dedicated podcast hub at ownthemomentpod.com.